Selected readers' comments to the New York Times article, Ethiopia's Agony, I have never seen this kind of cruelty in my life, written by Alexis Okeowo. December 5th, 2024. JAS writes, excellent reporting. Thank you for the spotlight on a tragedy that many news outlets don't cover. This is why I keep renewing my subscription. Casey writes, this is one of the best articles I've read in a while. Thank you for both the individual testimonies through individual interviews and the wider perspective from Steve Ratner and Alex DeWall. At a time when I'm now skipping the endless stories about YS politics, this international reporting restores my faith in the newspaper's journalism. Anna writes, Alexis Okeowo has written some of the most compelling journalism I've read in a long time, often with an eye trained on the specific conflicts and stories of Africa and the African diaspora. I am incredibly grateful for her work highlighting these often dismissed topics, LR writes. Thank you to the brave reporters who brought this story out. I followed with distress the Ethiopian civil war when it occurred but never understood how it came to pass, nor anything of the ethnic tensions. Catherine Rauch writes, the beautiful country Ethiopia deserves better. I know people who have been to Ethiopia and return expressing an enduring love for the people and the land. I wish I could reach out in a more effective way to help you. If only it was as easy to create peace as it seems so easy for people to wage war. And the psychological after effects of war's trauma perpetuate war in the mind, which is invisible yet enduring. Nevertheless, we cannot give up on working for peace, even if we do not know how. I wish you peace. Kelly Grace Smith writes, this absolutely horrific. What I would call our attention to is the growing division, disrespect, cruelty, and inhumanity across the world, including our own country. We are not far behind in our feuds, sexist, and ethnic prejudices, despite the fact that this nation is so incredibly rich in land, resources, wealth, education, and brain power. Unless and until we stop the rapidly widening income gap and begin to create economic opportunity for all and prohibit the ceaseless price gouging by our own American corporations and companies, we will find the downward trajectory of our nation increasing with both velocity and inhumanity. No matter who we are or where we are, all around this world, without our humanity, we will possess nothing of value. Carl Berman writes, simply extraordinary journalism and also extraordinarily disturbing to the conscience and the soul. Kudos to the Times for fearlessly diving into the tough nitty-gritty of the fight-or-fight experience in this tragically war-torn area of Africa. Common Sense writes, good thing we gave Abiy that Nobel Peace Prize. He sure restored balance to the region. A Smith writes, where is the African Union in all of this? I mean, it is literally headquartered right in Ethiopia. But this article makes no mention of the role the AU in anything. It sounds like the situation is so hot that there needs to be outside negotiators to bring the sides together. This is tragic. Alan writes, the AU is a talking shop filled with self-serving dictators who don't want to rock the boats of their brethren. May writes, I'm sorry for all killings. Yet I don't know why in America and certain parts of the world we focus on certain conflicts and not others. Here, there are people suffering that I did not even know about. D writes, great article, highlighting an absolute tragedy. Perhaps the Times and college students galore should look inwards a bit and reflect on why this wasn't covered constantly on the front page and wasn't the subject of student protests for a ceasefire. Maybe the Times should also cover, more extensively than one puny article, how Turkey, a U.S. NATO ally, is using American F-16s to massacre the Kurds. The Seven Samurai writes, this article describes a rare look into what is going on in Africa. Well, it's only rare because no one is looking. It's a lot easier and more profitable to report 95% of the time about one small country in the Middle East. Al writes, yep, endless coverage of Ukraine and Israel and Gaza, and yet I doubt the majority of Americans are even aware the recent Ethiopian civil war ever happened. L writes, horrific, beyond belief. Another instance in which the ICC is blind while prosecuting Israel Netanyahu is profoundly flawed. I do not support all his policies, but he does not support mass rape and true genocide. Kavino writes, because some regions have no strategic or economic value to America is why we ignore these people, especially if they are dark-skinned. Ancient writes, after 60 years of reading news, I'm so tired of the words Liberation Front. They always turn out to be the opposite. Wanda writes, I love Ethiopia. For the good and safety of the people, I hope this ends soon. As Dr. Ikeda wrote, nothing is more barbarous than war. Nothing is more cruel. Emma writes, I visited Ethiopia and Tigray in 2019, specifically to see the early Christian churches, some carved out of caves or of solid stone, and other archaeological sites. The Tigray countryside and churches were stunningly beautiful, completely unlike the horrific images I had seen on the news in the 1980s. The overall infrastructure seemed up and coming. Ethiopian Airlines had a modern, well-maintained fleet of aircraft that serviced all the regions on a timely basis. Ethiopia seemed on the cusp of becoming an economic and cultural power in Africa. Little did I know that in less than a year, such a beautiful region with millennia of history would be plunged back into hell. It is such a destructive shame people cannot see beyond tribal allegiances. A.J. Garcia writes, do not blame the people for divisions that politicians themselves are responsible for whipping up. From what I've just read, it seems this failure came from the top, from the Ethiopian government. They needed a bad guy to account for their own failures, and they found one in a long maligned ethnic group. This, combined with outside agitators like the UAE, is the primary reason that peace remains elusive in Ethiopia and so many other parts of the world, including our own. Global Citizen writes, the religious affiliation of the various tribes and groups goes largely unmentioned. Religion is a necessary factor to understand the conflict. There is one mention of Muslims destroying churches. It seems that Muslims and Christians fighting each other with an overlay of tribal allegiances. As good as the reporting is, this aspect is conspicuous by its absence. Three Rivers writes, an excellent and sad story. I am reminded once again of the shock doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein. Disaster capitalism moves in when a community or country is in shock from a natural disaster or man-made disaster such as war. Davy and Goliath writes, this is horrific, as in Sudan. No words. Credit to the journalists here. Where are the UN and world powers? Shameful commission by omission. We can't fight all wars, but this is no small war. As bad as Ukraine, Gaza, and Lebanon are, the numbers dead from the Ethiopian conflict the past few years appears to be about 1 million. Incomprehensible. And an argument why the US must step in to help stop the killing and try to build peace in the region. And a reason why Trump's so-called America First is not based on American values. And bad for the world. Eduardo writes, the old TV cartoon from the 60s, terrible situation, no doubt. But since World War II, what US foreign intervention has worked out well? Maybe Korea? Time for the US to get out of the intervention business. And I do mean business. Time to give the rest of the world a chance to survive on their own. We disrespect those who, in our view, cannot take care of themselves. To me, this is only a more pernicious, modern version of colonialism. Mask of Comedy Tragedy writes, it is not clear to me what would reduce the tensions amongst these groups. This is why tribalism of any sort is so toxic to the idea of a nation-state. People have to see themselves as Ethiopian first. If everything is about the various tribes, then they will always be in conflict. I can't see how it can be otherwise unless there are strong cultural reforms to push the concept of an identity beyond one's tribe. Who benefits from this level of violence and chaos? A country cannot succeed economically in this turmoil. With that said, someone, somewhere is likely benefiting. Who? If the end goal is dominance by one minority tribe, this will continue to be an unstable situation. Thank you for reporting on these conflicts that have religious and ethnic components, even though the color of the people is the same. It is important to understand the nuances. This is not simply civil war between two similar groups who have different political ideologies. M writes, not to take away from what is reported here, but I wanted to add that currently both political parties in the US are benefiting from promoting tribalism, whether it is on racial, religious, ethnic, or gender lines. This does not bode well for us. We need to start seeing ourselves as American first and foremost. I sometimes feel we need a third party that will unify like-minded people across the different tribes. Tribalism will get us nowhere, and both parties pander to it. The U.S. could and should set an example to other countries of how nation-state can rise above tribalism. Instead, we are also succumbing to division and infighting. Something to Say writes, "What a catastrophe." I toured Ethiopia in 2019, including the gorgeous multi-day Timkut festival in Lalibela, and it was gorgeous and welcoming country. Mark writes, "Why and how is it that the population can afford what appears to be an endless amount of armaments and yet nothing else?" Japi writes, "Foreign nations fund and supply these conflicts. Articles like these should name them. Russia, Saudis, US?" Mark L. Knuckles writes, "As in so much of Africa, so-called war crimes are really the result of international corporations, global finance institutions, and the legacy of colonialism." Bay Area 101 writes, "In the case of Ethiopia, as it is elsewhere, the genocide and other war crimes are the responsibility of those committing and directing them. It defies common sense to imagine otherwise." Stan Current writes, "Thank you, New York Times. This is what we're coming to. The oppressed become oppressive. Women and children suffer the worst. Other countries side with one or the other. There is no intervention to stop the cruelty. God help the people of Ethiopia. No one is." John Galty writes, "Very sad reading this news. It shows that the Palestinian cause has been far overstated and taken far too much of the world's resources looking for ways to appease them when they want nothing short of the end of Israel. The New York Times and other publications would do well to spend more time educating readers on African issues, which far outweigh the importance of Palestinian suffering, which is the result of their rampage of October 7th. So glad the New York Times is covering this African disaster." Greg McVeary writes, "Ethiopia seemed to be an answer to the chaos of Africa. Most of the countries in Africa were drawn on the map by foreign colonizers. As in India, the approach was to include disparate ethnic groups in the polity and then pit them against each other, allowing domination by the small colonial elite. As the colonial era ended, chaos logically ensued in so many of these countries. Never conquered Ethiopia was the exception, its colors a source of pride for the African diaspora. Well, dominance and border drawing by Europeans is clearly not the problem here. Another simple prescription exploded." Dave writes, "Very good reporting and article. But why not more news the past several years on this horrific conflict? A war which has apparently taken over 1 million lives. Sickening. It's real tragedy and shame what's going on in Ethiopia." Kathy writes, "What would so many African countries be like if they hadn't been devastated over hundreds of years by the mid-Atlantic trade in enslaved people? Societies cannot thrive when their young people are stolen over and over again." Mao writes, "I wish the writers spent some time trying to identify the root causes of these conflicts. The article does a decent job of describing the horrific events objectively, but it misses the bigger picture." Years ago, some so-called intellectuals decided that dividing Ethiopia along ethnic lines, inspired by Marxist and Stalinist ideas, was the best way forward. This created a system where regions and tribes function as semi-independent states, constantly competing over limited resources in a zero-sum game. Throw in rampant corruption and extreme poverty, and unfortunately, it feels like the worst is still ahead. Don Schaefer writes, "We were in Ethiopia as tourists the year before the war with Tigray started. Everything looked so hopeful then. The country was experiencing a surge of development. Ethiopia was a model for other East Africa countries. Abiy apparently thought that he could bring Tigray under country easily, instead starting a process that might splinter the nation. This is all so sad." Mountain Heel writes, "Thanks for publishing this. It has long bothered me how the media can all but ignore some incredibly brutal conflicts. I think it's good that there is reporting on what is happening in Ukraine and Gaza, but so often it feels like we turn a blind eye to so much suffering, particularly in Africa." Larry writes, "Excellent article, the world should know. And yet no campus protests.